Auditing in Windows NT. We're going to cover the two primary reasons to set up auditing, how to set an audit policy, and then how to implement auditing throughout your resources. Okay, so what are the two reasons to set up auditing? Well, number one would be to try to catch a hacker. Try to catch somebody who's doing something they're not supposed to do. In that case, what we're going to do is audit for failed events. We're going to try to see when someone has attempted to log in unsuccessfully, attempted to access a resource unsuccessfully. The second reason to set up auditing is to do some kind of prediction of resource usage, to determine when you're going to need to upgrade your resources, buy another server, buy another printer. An example of that would be auditing successful events. For example, a secretary printing. Sometimes I'll audit how many times certain secretaries will print so that I know when to buy a new printer, upgrade the printer, or maybe add another printer to a printer pool. So with auditing, what we're doing is we're basically looking at what's going on the network or on the NT machine. So to set up auditing, first we have to enable it, and we do this at the primary domain controller for the domain. Now, when you're setting up auditing, auditing is per the domain directory services database. More accurately, it's per the directory services database. Now, with a primary domain controller, the directory services database is the directory services database for the domain. Now, this one directory services database is the read-write version, the domain directory services database. That actual database gets copied down to each BDC and is stored on the BDC in a read-only state. The backup domain controllers are there to authenticate users, but when a change is made to the directory services database, when a new user is added, when a password is changed, that happens at the primary domain controller. Now, the auditing policy, being that it's set per directory services database, you can see that in a domain environment, you set auditing one time. You set it with the user manager for domains, and user manager for domains is going to set the focus to the directory services database of the PDC. Now, if you're auditing an NT workstation or an NT member server, the SAM from the PDC is only synchronized to the backup domain controllers, to the BDCs. For the member server or the NT workstation, their directory service databases are standalone. Now, a member server is simply an NT server that has not been configured to be a domain controller. The reason to remove the domain controller responsibilities, the ability to validate logons or have the domain directory services database, is to relieve that server of a little bit of load. Just make it able to process what it's doing a little bit faster. A lot of times we'll make an Exchange server, a member server, or a SQL server, or something that requires high-end processing. So with the member server and the NT workstation having their own directory services database, what we have to realize is that auditing is set at each individual member server, at each individual NT workstation. So let me ask a question. If I wanted to audit a resource, and the resource exists here, where do I set the auditing? The answer is using user manager for domains on the primary domain controller directory services database. Now let's say I want to audit a resource or a printer that exists on an NT workstation. Where do I turn on the auditing? The answer in that case is user manager run from that NT workstation, or if you prefer, you can run user manager for domains, but make sure that you set the focus to the local directory services database. When I say set the focus to, I mean select from the main menu, the menu item that says select domain, and then type in this guy's computer name. That will set the focus for that tool to the local SAM database. And then finally, if I wanted to audit a resource on this member server over here, same as with the NT workstation. We're going to want to set auditing using the user manager for domains setting the focus to the local directory services database. Okay, so once we have turned on the auditing with the user manager for domains, the next step is to enable auditing at each resource that we want to audit. Now, there are certain auditing policies that will just automatically start working. If you're auditing logons and logoffs, for example, you turn on the auditing policy at user manager for domains, and now you start auditing logons and logoffs. For resources, however, you turn on the audit policy, and then you go to the individual resource, and you enable auditing at each resource. We'll go over how to enable the auditing at the resource with the on-screen demonstration. One thing you want to remember with auditing is that you don't want to go overboard for two reasons. Number one, if you audit everything, it'll make it hard to find whatever it is that you're actually trying to find. So it'll be a needle in a haystack. And number two, you're going to add a little bit of unnecessary overhead to your system. So a good rule of thumb is audit only specific things that you want to look for. So once your auditing is turned on and you've enabled it at the resource, you're collecting information for that particular audited event. You're collecting information for the log-on, log-off, or you're collecting information for that particular resource access. Who's trying to read it, who's trying to delete it. So, where do you view the results? Well, the answer is in the event viewer, the security log. So open up your event viewer, and then from the main menu, click Security to view the security log. We'll go over how to view the results when we do the on-screen demonstration. Okay, we covered the two main reasons to audit, one to catch hackers, one to predict resource usage. We covered the tool you use to turn auditing on, User Manager for Domains. We talked about where that tool actually makes the change for the domain, Directory Services Database, also known as the SAM, on the PDC, for a member server or an NT workstation on the local Directory Services Database. We talked about where to view the results, Event Viewer, Security Log. Now let's go over the actual on-screen demonstration of setting up an audit policy and then viewing the results.